For centuries, the prevailing view has been that former officials are subject to impeachment, and you just heard a full discussion of that. The House has repeatedly acknowledged that fact. But in the vast majority of cases, the House has rightly recognized that an official's resignation or departure makes the extraordinary step of impeachment unnecessary and maybe even unwise. As a House manager rightly explained in the Belknap case, and I quote, "There is no likelihood that we shall ever unlimber the clumsy and bulky monster piece of ordnance to take aim at an object from which all danger has gone by," end quote. President Trump's case, though, is different. The danger has not gone by. His threat to democracy makes any prior abuse by any government official pale in comparison. Moreover, allowing his conduct to pass without the most decisive response would itself create an extraordinary danger to the nation, inviting further abuse of power and signaling that the Congress of the United States is unable or unwilling to respond to insurrection incited by the president. Think about that. To paraphrase Justice Robert Jackson, who said that that precedent that I just described would lie about like a loaded weapon ready for the hand of any future president who decided in his final months to make a play for unlimited power. Think of the danger. Here is the rare case in which love of the Constitution and commitment to our democracy required the House to impeach. It's for the same reason the Senate can and must try this case. Next, President Trump will assert that it somehow is significant or it matters that the Chief Justice isn't presiding over this trial. Let me state this very plainly. It does not matter. It is not significant. Under Article 1, Section 3, when the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. There is only one person who is President of the United States at a time. Right now, Joseph R. Biden, Jr. is the 46th President of the United States. As a result, the requirement that the Chief Justice preside isn't triggered. Instead, the normal rules of any impeachment of anyone other than the sitting president apply. And under those rules, the President pro tem, Senator Leahy, can preside. And of course, this makes perfect sense. The Chief Justice presides because when the current president is on trial, if the Chief Justice doesn't preside, the Vice President could preside. And it would be a conflict for someone to preside over a trial that would become president if there was a conviction. So there isn't that concern when you have a former president on trial, or for that matter, when you have anyone on trial other than the current president, which is why the Chief Justice presides only in that single case, and why this is exactly the presiding officer the Constitution and the Senate rules require. As a fallback, President Trump and his lawyers may argue today that he should get a free pass on inciting an armed insurrection against the United States government and endangering Congress because, as he would put it, this impeachment is somehow unconstitutional. So far as I understand it from reading the pleadings in this case, this defense involves cobbling together a bunch of meritless legal arguments, all of them attempting to focus on substance rather than jurisdiction, and insisting that these kitchen sink objections lead the Senate to not try the case. Since they may raise these points at this juncture, I feel obliged really to address them. He may argue, for example, that he didn't receive enough process in the House, even though the House proceedings are more like a grand jury action, which is followed later by trial in the Senate with a full presentation of evidence. Even though the evidence of his high crimes and misdemeanors is overwhelming and supported by a huge public record. Even though we're going to put that evidence before you at this trial, and even though have a full and fair opportunity to respond to it before all of you. Even though hundreds of others involved in the events of January 6th have already been charged for their role in attacks that the president incited. And even though we invited him to voluntarily come here and testify and tell his story. a request, as you know, that his lawyers immediately refused, presumably because they understood what would happen if he were to testify under oath. Regardless, President Trump's process arguments are not only wrong on their own terms, but they're also completely irrelevant to the question of whether you should hold this trial. That question is answered by the Constitution, and the answer is yes. In addition, separate from his due process complaints, President Trump and his counsel, particularly his counsel, have boasted on TV that to counter the undisputed evidence of what actually happened in this case, you'll see video clips. They'll show video clips of other politicians, including Democratic politicians, using what they consider incendiary language. Apparently, they think this will establish some sort of equivalency, or that it will show in contrast that President Trump's statements at the Save America rally weren't so bad. Like so much of what President Trump's lawyers might say today, that's a gimmick. It's a parlor game, meant to inflame partisan hostility and play on our divisions. So let me be crystal clear. President Trump was not impeached because the words he used, viewed in isolation, without context, were beyond the pale. Plenty of other politicians have used strong language, but Donald J. Trump was president of the United States. He sought to overturn a presidential election that had been upheld by every single court to consider it. He spent months insisting to his base that the only way he could lose was a dangerous, wide-ranging conspiracy against them and America itself. He relentlessly attempted to persuade his followers that the peaceful transfer of power that was taking place in the Capitol was an abomination that had to be stopped at all costs. He flirted with groups like the Proud Boys, telling them to stand back and stand by, while endorsing violence and sparking death threats to his opponents. He summoned an armed, angry, and dangerous crowd that wanted to keep him in power and was widely reported to be poised on a hair trigger for violence at his direction. He then made his heated statements in circumstances where it was clear, where it was foreseeable that those statements would spark extraordinary, imminent violence. He then failed to defend the Capitol, the Congress, and the Vice President during the insurrection, engaging in extraordinary dereliction of duty and desertion of duty that was only possible because of the high office he held. He issued statements during the insurrection, targeting the Vice President and reiterating the very same lies about the election that had launched the violence in the first place. And he issued a tweet 5 hours after the Capitol was sacked, in which he sided with the bad guys. We all know that context matters, that office and meaning and intent and consequences matter. Simply put, it matters when and where and how we speak. The oaths we sworn and the power we hold matter. President Trump was not impeached because he used words that the House decided are forbidden or unpopular. He was impeached for inciting armed violence against the government of the United States of America. This leads me to a few final thoughts about why it's so important for you to hear this case as authorized and as indeed required by our history and by the Constitution. President Trump's lawyers will say, I expect, that you should dismiss this case so that the country can move on. They'll assert that this impeachment is partisan and that the spirit of bipartisanship and bipartisan cooperation requires us to drop the case and march forward in unity. With all due respect, every premise and every conclusion of that argument is wrong. Just weeks ago, The President of the United States literally incited an armed attack on the Capitol, our seat of government, while seeking to retain power by subverting an election he lost, and then celebrated the attack. People died. People were brutally injured. President Trump's actions endangered every single member of Congress, his own vice president, thousands of congressional staffers, and our own Capitol Police and other law enforcement. This was a national tragedy, a disaster for America's standing in the world. And President Trump is singularly responsible for inciting it. As we will prove, the attack on the Capitol was not solely the work of extremists lurking in the shadows. Indeed, does anyone in this chamber honestly believe that but for the conduct of President Trump, that charged in the article of impeachment, that attack at the Capitol would have occurred? Does anybody believe that? And now his lawyers will come before you and insist, even as the Capitol is still surrounded with barbed wires and fences and soldiers, that we should just move on, let bygones be bygones, and allow President Trump to walk away without any accountability, any reckoning, any consequences. That cannot be right. That is not unity. That's the path to fear of what future presidents could do. So there's a good reason why this article of impeachment passed the House with bipartisan support. The principles at stake belong to all Americans from all walks of life. We have a common interest in making clear that there are lines nobody can cross, especially the President of the United States. And so we share an interest in this trial where the truth can be shown and where President Trump can be called to account for his offenses. William Faulkner famously wrote that the past is never dead. But this isn't even the past. This just happened. It's still happening. Look around you as you come to the Capitol and come to work. I really do not believe that our attention span is so short, that our sense of duty so frail, our factional loyalty so all-consuming, that the president can provoke an attack on Congress itself and get away with it just because it occurred near the end of his term. After a betrayal like this, there cannot be unity without accountability. And this is exactly what the Constitution calls for. The framers' original understanding, this chamber's own precedent, and the very words used in the Constitution all confirm unquestionably, indisputably, that President Trump must stand trial for his high crimes and misdemeanors against the American people. We cannot continue down the path of partisanship and division that has turned the Capitol into an armed fortress. Senators, it now falls to you to bring our country together by holding this trial, and once all the evidence is before you, by delivering justice. Thank you.
Congressman David Cicilline, and now the lead House manager, Congressman
Senator, Mr. President, to close, I want to say something personal about the stakes of this decision, whether President Trump can stand trial and be held to account for inciting insurrection against us. This trial is personal indeed for every senator, for every member of the House, every manager, all of our staff, the Capitol Police, the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, the National Guard, maintenance and custodial crews, the print journalists and TV people who were here, and all of our families and friends. And I hope this trial reminds America how personal democracy is, and how personal is the loss of democracy, too. Distinguished members of the Senate, my youngest daughter, Tabitha, was there with me on Wednesday, January 6th. It was the day after we buried her brother, our son, Tommy, the saddest day of our lives. Also, there was my son-in-law, Hank, who's married to our oldest daughter, Hannah, and I consider him a son too, even though he eloped with my daughter and didn't tell us what they were going to do. But it was in the middle of COVID-19. But the reason they came with me that Wednesday, January 6th, was because they wanted to be together with me in the middle of a devastating week for our family. And I told them I had to go back to work because we were counting electoral votes that day on January 6th. It was our constitutional duty. And I invited them instead to come with me to witness this historic event, the peaceful transfer of power in America. And they said they heard that President Trump was calling on his followers to come to Washington to protest, and they asked me directly, would it be safe? Would it be safe? And I told them, of course it should be safe. This is the Capitol. Steny Hoyer, our majority leader, had kindly offered me the use of his office on the House floor because I was one of the managers that day and we were going through our grief. So Tabitha and Hank were with me in Steny's office as colleagues dropped by to console us about the loss of our middle child, Tommy, our beloved Tommy. Mr. Neguse and Mr. Cicilline actually came to see me that day. Dozens of members, lots of Republicans, lots of Democrats came to see me. And I felt a sense of being lifted up from the agony. And I won't forget their tenderness. And through the tears, I was working on a speech for the floor when we would all be together in joint session. And I wanted to focus on unity when we met in the House. I quoted Abraham Lincoln's famous 1838 Lyceum speech, where he said that if division and destruction ever come to America, it won't come from abroad. It'll come from within, said Lincoln. And in that same speech, Lincoln passionately deplored mob violence. This was right after the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist newspaper editor. And Lincoln deplored mob violence, and he deplored mob rule. And he said it would lead to tyranny and despotism in America. That was the speech I gave that day after the House very graciously and warmly welcomed me back. And Tabitha and Hank came with me to the floor, and they watched it from the gallery. And when it was over, they went back to that office, Steny's office, off of the House floor. They didn't know that the House had been breached yet, and that an insurrection, a riot, or a coup had come to Congress. And by the time we learned about it, about what was going on, it was too late. I couldn't get out there to be with them in that office. And all around me, people were calling their wives and their husbands, their loved ones, to say goodbye. Members of Congress, in the House anyway, were removing their congressional pins so they wouldn't be identified by the mob as they tried to escape the violence. Our new chaplain got up and said a prayer for us, and we were told to put our gas masks on. And then there was a sound I will never forget, the sound of pounding on the door like a battering ram. The most haunting sound I ever heard, and I will never forget it. My chief of staff, Julie Tagan, was with Tabitha and Hank locked and barricaded in that office. The kids hiding under the desk, placing what they thought were their final texts and whispered phone calls to say their goodbyes. They thought they were going to die. My son-in-law had never even been to the Capitol before. And when they were finally rescued, over an hour later by Capitol officers, and we were together, I hugged them and I apologized, and I told my daughter Tabitha, who's 24 and a brilliant algebra teacher in Teach for America. Now, I told her how sorry I was, and I promised her that it would not be like this again the next time she came back to the Capitol with me. And you know what she said? She said, "Dad, I don't want to come back to the Capitol again." Of all the terrible, brutal things I saw and I heard on that day, and since then, that one hit me the hardest. That and watching someone use an American flagpole with the flag still on it to spear and pummel one of our police officers ruthlessly, mercilessly, tortured by a pole with a flag on it that he was defending with his very life. People died that day. Officers ended up with head damage and brain damage. People's eyes were gouged. An officer had a heart attack. An officer lost 3 fingers that day. 2 officers have taken their own lives. Senators, this cannot be our future. This cannot be the future of America. We cannot have presidents inciting and mobilizing mob violence against our government and our institutions because they refuse to accept the will of the people under the Constitution of the United States. Much less can we create a new January exception in our precious, beloved Constitution that prior generations have died for and fought for, so that corrupt presidents have several weeks to get away with whatever it is they want to do. History does not support a January exception in any way, so why would we invent one for the future? We close, Mr. President, and reserve your time.
Emotional House Lead Manager right there, Jamie Raskin, Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland, recalling those moments on January 6th inside the House chamber, reminding senators he was suffering a personal tragedy at that time, the loss of his son.
I ask unanimous consent. There now be a 10-minute break. I ask unanimous consent the Senate recess for 10 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
So the Senate will recess now after the House presents their initial case. They're coming back in 10 minutes for the president's lawyers to make their rebuttal on this constitutional question. The constitutional question at issue today, but you saw what the Democrats did right there, opening with what they hoped would be a knockout punch, that 13-minute video of the events on January 6th. Rachel Scott up there on Capitol Hill. Tell us what you heard about what was going on inside the chamber as that video played.
It was certainly tense inside of the Senate chamber as that 13-minute video played. We heard the echoes from that video inside, filling the room with the screams from the Capitol police officers, with the mob that stormed the United States Capitol on the day of the insurrection. You heard the silence after that video was played. And then you heard Congressman Jamie Raskin, the lead House impeachment manager, come forward and say, if that is not an impeachable offense, then what is? A Democratic aide sent me a message saying, if you are outraged, that is the point. And this is the goal that the House impeachment managers are trying to send by playing these videos in vivid detail. They are trying to force these senators who were witnesses to what happened there on January 6th to remember the violence, to remember the chaos, to remember the frenzy. And they are hoping to convince at least 17 Republican senators to join them in voting to convict. We know that inside, we're keeping our eye on a handful of Republicans, Senators Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins. They were taking extensive notes during that video and after. And then you heard from the rest of the impeachment managers coming forward to say that there can be no January exception. They say that today may feel like a little bit like a constitutional convention, but going forward, they are going to be prosecuting this case as if it is a criminal case, because that is exactly what they believe that it is. They say that a president must be held held responsible from his very first day in office all the way to his last, and we are going to see a very strong rebuttal from Trump's defense team, asking that this trial be immediately dismissed, George.
You actually heard, thank you, Rachel, you actually heard a pre-buttal in part from Congressman Cicilline of the arguments they expected to hear from the Trump legal team. I want to bring in John Carl for more on this. The video brought home the violence, the vulgarity that ensued in the Capitol on that day. We should say that, of course, the House managers did not share that video with anyone before they showed it on the Senate floor today. John, they also were focused on the president's actions and inactions on January 6th, and they repeated again and again that tweet that the president laid out at the end of the day where he seemed to vindicate what the protesters were doing, what the rioters were doing, saying these are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is stripped away.
And George, amazingly, that tweet, which was sent out at 6:01 p.m., so it's really after the riot, it's after the Capitol has been cleared, but the wreckage is everywhere, and Congress has not come back in yet. It couldn't have been at a more raw moment. The damage still there, and it ends, that tweet ends, "Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." Remember this day forever. He's talking about January 6th. He's talking about the efforts of his supporters to stop the election, to stop the transfer of power, to upend the election, to overturn the election, and saying, remember this day forever. And George, among those handful of Republicans that voted to impeach him in the House, several of them mentioned first and foremost what he did during the time the riot was going on. His silence as his own supporters invaded the Capitol, and then his failure to condemn what had happened. Indeed, his statements that effectively praised what had happened on that day.
John Carl, thanks. Senior White House correspondent Mary Bruce. 1 year ago, Mary, you were in the Capitol as the first impeachment trial of President Trump was underway. One of the things we're seeing here, both cases had to do with election interference in a way, but very, very different. And you also now saw, I think on the House floor today, the House managers learning some lessons from the presentation last year.
They absolutely have. I mean, look, there are some similarities between these cases, but there are certainly even more differences. This is far more cut and dry than the very complicated, nuanced tale that the managers had to really explain to the American people a year ago. And of course, as we've been saying, so many in the chamber witnessed this, and Americans witnessed it. And you saw, I think it was very intentional that the managers opened up their arguments here with that gut punch video, and that they ended their remarks, Jamie Raskin there, in deeply personal terms, explaining what is at stake here. They are arguing that the facts are not disputable. And yet, as we saw a year ago, that's not really what Republicans are arguing here. They aren't making a point here about the facts. They aren't coming really to the defense of the president on the merits of the case. They're arguing process. And that's what you're going to begin to see play out here this afternoon. And as we have seen Democrats defending so far, they simply say that this is unconstitutional, that this shouldn't be going forward. But what you have seen over the last several weeks since this horrific insurrection is really a divide in the Republican Party. And I have to say, I just kept thinking as we were watching that 13-minute video, and you could imagine all of those senators sitting there reliving that day, as all of us were in that same moment, about those 8 Republican senators who then, even after the violence, went ahead and stood still with President Trump and voted to overturn the election results, not to certify the results. And you have seen what has happened to this party in the last several weeks, how this violent attack on the Capitol has really cleaved the party. And while, yes, what we are seeing here is a question of accountability, a question of how to heal the country going forward, this trial is also very much about a test for the Republican Party, who is going to stand with Trump and who is going to break with him going forward. And we have already seen many leaders, even those who've condemned the president's actions, like Republican leader Mitch McConnell, coming out and suggesting that they will not vote to convict here because they simply do not think the case has grounds.
The question will be, okay, Mary Bruce, thanks very much. Will the facts being presented right now, will the evidence evidence being presented today and over the next several days change those minds? Terry Moran, we only saw 5 Republican senators vote against dismissing this case right at the outset. So I want to pose that question to you. Will presentations like this make a difference? Can they move more of those Republican minds?
Yeah, I can't see how they wouldn't move minds. That was intense, George. I mean, it was, from a trial perspective, it was a very effective presentation. It was organized, it was emotional, but it was also ominous. And it took direct aim, really, at what is, I think, for the House managers and those who are seeking to convict former President Trump, their biggest obstacle. The sense in the country, especially among Republicans, it's time to move on. The country faces very significant, pressing problems. And there is a sense, let's get after them. Let's put the past in the past and let's make sure we go forward. But I don't see how, as Mary just said, how senators, how Americans watching that video, going back to that moment, it can't just be from a civic sense, have their soul shattered by it. Because that trauma that we feel when we watch that, that's part of our present. That's part of our future. And in closing, Congressman Raskin saying, Senators, this can't be our future. Now, they may, still feel it's time to move on. They may still know that the Republican Party is in the grip of Donald Trump still hard. And they may not be able to summon the wherewithal to go and try him and vote to try him. But I just think that was such a powerful presentation. It will make them think about what their grandchildren will think about if they vote against holding him accountable.
I was speaking with one Republican senator today who said, of course, this is the most consequential vote he will face in his career. That's the politics. That's the emotion right there. Let's bring in our legal team for more on the presentations. Kate Shaw, let me begin with you. Assess what you saw from the House managers.
I think they did an extremely effective job of weaving together these legal and constitutional arguments, which can seem sort of dry and abstract, and the narrative and the stakes from the perspective of responsibility and accountability. So I think Raskin in particular did an effective job at communicating that, a vote that there is no jurisdiction over this conduct isn't just, kind of a meaningless or dry or constitutional vote. It is essentially a position that there can be no accountability, or at least this kind of accountability, which is the Constitution's most serious kind of accountability for official misconduct, is essentially off the table if it happens, and he said again and again, at the end of a president's term, right? He said there is no January exception to impeachment or to the presidential oath of office. And, it was quite ominous. I think he suggested that, again, a vote that there's no jurisdiction here essentially immunizes from responsibility this conduct and potential future presidential misconduct, so long as it happens late enough in a president's term.
That was the broad argument from Congressman Raskin. Dan Abrams, you also saw Congressman Cicilline especially take aim directly at the arguments we expect to hear from President Trump's lawyers.
Right, and I think that the most important argument that they tried to diffuse was this notion that when the president used the words fight like hell, that he meant them figuratively, and that they were saying, expect to hear President Trump's lawyers cite Democrats using words like we need to fight, etc. And that's why the context becomes so important here. That's why everything leading up to it becomes so critical. And that's why the allegations of voter fraud, the false allegations, are so significant, because that's what set them off. It wasn't just started on January 6th. It was incremental. And by the time you get to January 6th, what the president referred to as that sacred landslide election victory being stolen, in effect, what they're saying is you can understand why these people got so riled up. And that is very different, the House managers argue, than anything you're going to hear in terms of the comparisons from President Trump's team.
Thank you, Dan. Let me bring in Cecilia Vega, our chief White House correspondent. Cecilia, we were talking at the beginning of this broadcast that President Biden wants to focus on his agenda. He had his press secretary out there making her case to the White House reporters today. I think it's going to be pretty clear over the coming days, at least on this first day, it's going to be hard for anything else to break through right now, given what the House managers were presenting.
Yeah, exactly, George. And in fact, the president was just a few minutes ago asked point blank by reporters when they were in covering an event where he was speaking with business leaders whether he planned to be watching any of the proceedings. And he was pretty candid. He said, look, I've got a job to do. And he referenced the number of COVID deaths in this country at 450,000 at this point. He said the Senate has their job. And this is what we've been hearing from him and his team all along, and sort of punting to them to let this work itself out on Capitol Hill. That is the public message. But George, you know this from behind the scenes in the Clinton administration. You can say publicly that you want your team to stay focused on what's happening inside the White House, and the reality is people are still going to be following closely what's going on. This very much is dictating the narrative of the day in Washington. This was a significant amount of questions in the White House press briefing earlier this afternoon. And the White House is going to keep with this messaging that they are focused on COVID relief. They've got a deadline. They've got to get this passed, in their opinion. Time is of the essence. They are facing some deadlines, and so they are moving forward with this on Capitol Hill. But they're in a tough corner on this one. The president campaigned on bipartisanship, and he now is in this position where if he goes too hard on impeachment, he runs the risk of further alienating Republicans. And so he's going to keep, at this point, declining to answer these questions. But you can bet, George, that they're going to keep coming at them because as he has said that he believes that this trial should go forward, that it has to go forward. He really hasn't answered the question of whether he personally believes President Trump should be held accountable for what happened on January 6th and whether it is constitutional to impeach a former president.
Right. He cites it by saying, listen, I ran against him saying he was unfit for office. That's why I beat him. I want to bring in Martha Raddatz. Martha, you were outside of the Capitol before. You're back in the Bureau. Right now, you were among the protesters, among the rioters on January 6th. So you probably experienced some of that firsthand, but it is something else to see the events of several hours over that day condensed into 13 minutes.
It certainly was, George. It was really stunning seeing those 13 minutes of video, and it encapsulated what we really couldn't see from certain parts of outside into what was going on inside, what we could only imagine was going on inside. There were walking by the Washington Monument, thousands of people by the Washington Monument listening to President Trump's speech. And I'm sure what his defense team will talk about is the fact that the president did say peaceful, patriotic protests up there, but he also said that they were there to stop the steal, and of course referring to what he said was about the election. And the people I talked to said that is why we are here, to stop the steal. And the president said, we can't let that happen. And the anger grew. Starting out in that morning at the rally, it seemed like a peaceful protest, but people I was talking to, I saw people in tactical gear, former members of the military, and there were so many former members of the military, very worrisome. In fact, the Pentagon is going to take what's called a stand down to address extremism in the military. But they got angrier and angrier as they approached the Capitol, and there really was that frenzy. And you talk about that tweet at 6 p.m., that didn't stop people. There were still people on that plaza. And I would go up to them and say, the president just said, go home. He said, no, we're staying. It's the people's house. It was an absolute frenzy there.
Clearly was. Pierre Thomas, president on trial today in the Senate. This trial is going to be replicated, though, in courthouses across the country for those protesters and rioters who were there on January 6th.
George, this situation has resulted in perhaps the biggest investigation in FBI history. They have already charged over 190 people. 400 suspects have been identified. Hundreds more are possibly being investigated as well, George. Also, there's an ongoing threat that law enforcement is quite concerned about. They put out bulletins since the insurrection talking about the potential that domestic terrorists could attempt to do more acts of violence. So right now, the tension is still there. Law enforcement is still concerned. And it's interesting, as you watch that video unfold, you get a sense of what law enforcement has been talking to me about in terms of the sheer scale of the violence. We heard some new information today, I thought, from one of the congressman managers in which they talked about that at least one officer lost 3 fingers. Another officer had an eye gouged out. Someone may have suffered brain damage. So beyond the deaths, we're getting more and more a sense of just how brutal the attack on the officers were, George.
Pierre Thomas, thanks very much. Let's bring the legal team back in. Dan Abrams, let me begin with you. You can imagine that video being played in a courtroom to 12 jurors, approved by either side, and having some impact, but it's a reminder of how different these jurors are in this trial.
And I think it's important to remember how important watching the entire video is as well. That, later and tomorrow, and people will see clips of what was played. I think that they tried to put it into a short enough period that, for example, on social media and other places, that people might be able to see the entire thing. Because I think that's critical, because there's a story that's being told in that video, in that 13 minutes, the way you would in a courtroom. And I think that to isolate little pieces of it doesn't do what they presented justice.
And Kate, one of the other things we saw here is that as Joe Neguse and others were going through the Trump team's arguments, they were actually able to point up in a pre-buttal flaws inside the argument, outright mistakes that were made in the briefs.
That's right. So there are a handful of legal scholars cited in the president's brief. One of them, Brian Colt, took to Twitter yesterday and made clear that his views were totally misrepresented by the president's team. As we have been saying, the weight of the authority here is very squarely on the side of the impeachment managers on all of these legal and constitutional questions. Can you have, a former official sitting trial? Does the First Amendment serve as an obstacle to a conviction in the Senate? There's just not an even division of authority on these questions at all. The managers really have the support. And so the president's team has stretched to find support where there really isn't much. I think that is, so they're returning to these kinds of procedural arguments and arguments from readings of the text of the Constitution. But again, as you heard from the managers, even these conservative stalwarts, founders of the Federalist Society, people like Steve Calabresi, Michael McConnell, they really pretty uniformly support the position of the managers. And the Trump team just doesn't have a lot of, intellectual, historical sort of support for some of the constitutional arguments that they are making.
Kate Shaw, thanks very much. It's just after 3 p.m. here in the East, noon in the West, and we are, of course, covering the second impeachment trial of former President Trump. The House managers have made their case. Want to bring in our senior correspondent, Terry Moran, for more on this. And Terry, it's a reminder as well, as you saw some of the mistakes being pointed out by the House managers, how much difficulty President Trump has had putting together a legal team for this fight.
He sure has. The lawyers who stood by him and represented him in his first impeachment, they've abandoned ship, or they don't want any part of this. He then had a team of lawyers who were challenging the election during those weeks before the insurrectionist riot at the Capitol. They dropped out one by one. He's had a hard time finding people to defend him, and now he does. But people who are proper trial lawyers and will raise the kinds of things that would be raised in a court. But you've just been talking about how different it is. The Constitution it is a constitutional process designed by the framers to be tried by the people's representatives. It's political.
We're about to hear from the president's lawyers now.
And Ms. Raska has 33 minutes.
May I proceed, Mr. President?
You may.
This is President's lawyer, Bruce Castor.
Mr. President and members of the United States Senate, thank you for taking the time to hear from me. My name is Bruce Castor. I am the lead counsel for the 45th President of the United States. I was an assistant DA for such a long time, I keep saying prosecutor, but I do understand the difference, Mr. Raskin. Before I begin, I want to comment on the outstanding presentation from our opponents and the emotion that certainly welled up in Congressman Raskin about his family being here during that terrible day. And you will not hear any member of the team representing former President Trump say anything but in the strongest possible way denounce the violence of the rioters and those that breached the Capitol, the very citadel of our democracy. Literally the symbol that flashes on television whenever you're trying to explain that we're talking about the United States. Instant symbol. To have it attacked is repugnant in every sense of the word. The loss of life is horrific. I spent many long years prosecuting homicide cases, catching criminals that committed murders. I have quite an extensive experience in dealing with the aftermath of those things. Certainly, as a FOP member and a member of many police organizations myself, we mourn the loss of the Capitol Police officer, who I understand is laying not too far away from here. And you know, many of you in this room, over your careers before they reached this summit here in the Senate, would have had times where you represented your local communities as assistant district attorneys, assistant commonwealth attorneys, assistant state attorneys. And you know this to be true, that when a horrific event occurred in your county or in your jurisdiction, if it was a state jurisdiction, you know that there was a terrible outcry, and the public immediately reacts with a desire that someone pay because something really bad happened. And that is a natural reaction of human beings. It's a natural reaction of human beings because we are generally a social people. We enjoy being around one another, even in D.C. We recognize that people all the world over, and especially Americans who share that special bond with one another, love the freedoms that this country gives us. And we all feel that if somebody is unsafe when they're walking down the street, that the next person that's unsafe could be you, your spouse, one of your children, some other person that you love and know personally. So you'll never hear anybody representing former President Trump say anything at all other than what happened on January 6th and the storming and breaching of the Capitol should be denounced in the most vigorous terms, nor that those persons responsible should be prosecuted to the fullest extent that our laws allow. And indeed, I have followed some of those cases and those prosecutions, and it seems to me that we're doing a pretty good job of identifying and prosecuting those persons who committed those offenses. And I commend the FBI and the District of Columbia Police and the other agencies for their work. It's natural to recoil. It's an immediate thing. It comes over you without your ability to stop it. The desire for retribution. Who caused this awful thing? How do we make them pay? We recognize in the law, and I know many of you are lawyers, probably lawyers, some of you, I've been a lawyer 35 years, longer than me. Many longer than me, probably. And we know we have a specific body of law that deals with passion and rage, blinding logic and reason. That's the difference between manslaughter and murder. Manslaughter is the killing of a human being upon sudden and intense provocation. But murder is done with cold blood and reflective thought. We are so understanding of the concept that people's minds can be overpowered with emotion where logic does not immediately kick in, that we have recognized examples that otherwise would be hearsay and said that no, when you're driving down the street and you look over at your wife and you say, hey, you know what? That guy's about to drive through the red light and kill that person. Your wife can testify to what you said, because even though it's technically hearsay, it's an exception because it's the event living through the person. Why? No opportunity for reflective thought. And there's all sorts of examples that we recognize in the law for why people immediately desire retribution, immediately recognize in the law that people can be overcome by events. And you know, senators of the United States, they're not ordinary people. They're extraordinary people, in the technical sense, extraordinary people. When I was growing up in suburban Philadelphia, my parents were big fans of Senator Everett Dirksen from Illinois. And Senator Dirksen recorded a series of lectures that my parents had on a record. And we still know what records are, right? On the thing you put the needle down on and you play it. And here's little Bruce, 8, 9, 10 years old, listening to this back in the late 60s. And I would be listening to that voice. If you ever heard Everett Dirksen's voice, it's the most commanding, gravelly voice that just oozes belief and sincerity. Must have been a phenomenal United States senator. He doesn't talk about ordinary people as we do in the law. We apply the ordinary person standard. He talks about extraordinary people. He talks about gallant men, was the name of the album. And now, of course, in the sign of the times, gallant men and women. And I would watch television, and I would watch Senator Goldwater or Senator Byrd or Senator Mansfield, Senator Dole, and I would be fascinated by these great men. And everybody's parents say this when they're growing up. You could grow up to be a United States senator. You could do that. They're just men and women like you are. Well, then Everett Dirksen tells us that they're not. They're gallant men and women that do extraordinary things when their country needs them to do it. United States senators really are different. And I have been around United States senators before. 2 of them in this room from Pennsylvania, I like to think, are friendly toward me, or at least friends of mine when we're not politically adverse. And I have been around their predecessors. And one thing I have discovered, whether it be Democrats or Republicans, United States senators are patriots first. Patriots first. They love their country. They love their families. They love the states that they represent. There isn't a member in this room who has not used the term, I represent the great state of fill in the blank. Why? Because they're all great? Yeah. But you think yours is greater than others because these are your people. These are the people that sent you here to do their work. They trusted you with the responsibility of representative government. You know, I feel proud to know my senators. Senator Casey up here in the back, Senator Toomey over to the left. You know, it's funny, this is an aside, but it's funny. You ever notice how when you're talking or you hear others talking about you when you're home in your state, they will say, you know, I talked to my senator, or I talked to somebody on the staff of my senator. It's always my senator. Why is it that we say my senator? We say that because the people you represent are proud of their senators. They absolutely feel that connection of pride, because that's not just Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. That's my senator from Pennsylvania, or Bob Casey from Scranton. That's my senator. And you like that. People like that. The people back home really do. And United States senators have a reputation, and it's deserved. They have a reputation for cool-headedness, being erudite. The men and women that we send from back home to D.C. to look after our interests. We feel a sense of ownership and a sense of pride in our senators. There's plenty of times I've been around in political gatherings where I hear, there's no way Senator Toomey's going to allow that. I don't mean to pick on you, Pat, but there's no way Senator Casey is going to allow that. Because we feel pride, and something bad is potentially in the wind. And we expect our United States senators not reacting to popular will and not reacting to popular emotions. We expect them to do what is right, notwithstanding what is immediately and expedient that the media tells us is the topic of the day. So senators are patriots. Senators are family men and women. They're fierce advocates for the great state in which they represent. And somewhere far down that list of attributes, way below patriot, and way below love of family and country, and way below fierce advocates for their states, far down, at least that's what I thought, anyway, and I still think that. Somewhere far down that list, senators have some obligation to be partisans, to represent a group of beliefs that are similar to beliefs shared by other United States senators. I understand that. And in fact, I have no problem with that system. It helps us debate and decide what is best for America. The robust debate of different points of view. And I dare say that Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell represent those things in this body and make sure that everything is talked out and robustly debated in this room before United States senators make a decision of extreme importance to the people they represent. I know you aren't allowed to talk, but I don't see either one of them jumping up and saying I'm wrong about that, because I think that that's what happens. I think United States senators try to listen to each other's views. I think United States senators try to do what is right for the country. And far down is partisanship. In our system of government, and if you read the Federalist Papers, we're very fortunate because the Federalist Papers were authored as an explanation for why it is the states, the original states, should adopt the Constitution. These were persuasive documents about why the Constitution is a good thing. Because if the individual state legislatures didn't adopt the Constitution, we would not have it. So Mr. Jay and Mr. Madison and Mr. Hamilton, they had an incentive to explain what they were thinking when they wrote it, because they are explaining to other erudite people who represent individual states why it is that they feel that this is the right thing to do. And in fact, as many of you well know, Madison had to promise that there would be a Bill of Rights immediately upon adoption, or we wouldn't have a Constitution. Even then, there was a horse trading going on in the legislative body of the United States. The other day, when I was down here in Washington, I came down earlier in the week to try to figure out how to find my way around. I worked in this building 40 years ago. I got lost then, and I still do. But in studying the Constitution, in all the years I was a prosecutor, where so many things depend on interpretations of phrases in the Constitution, I learned that this body, which one of my worthy colleagues said is the greatest deliberative body in the entire world, and I agree, that particular aspect of our government was intentionally created, if you read the Federalist Papers. The last time a body such as the United States Senate sat at the pinnacle of government with the responsibility that it has today, it was happening in Athens, and it was happening in Rome. Republicanism, the form of government, republicanism, throughout history has always, and without exception, fallen because of fights from within, because of partisanship from within, because of bickering from within. And in each one of those examples that I mentioned, and there are certainly others probably that are smaller countries that lasted for less time that I don't know about off the top of my head, but each one of them, once there was the vacuum created that the greatest deliberative bodies, the Senate of Greece and sitting in Athens, the Senate of Rome, the moment that they devolved into such partisanship, it's not as though they ceased to exist. They ceased to exist as representative democracy, both replaced by totalitarianism. Paraphrasing the famous quote from Benjamin Franklin, who, as a Philadelphian, I feel as though I can do that because he's my founding father too. He who would trade liberty for some temporary security deserves neither liberty nor security. If we restrict liberty to attain security, we will lose both. And isn't the way we have enshrined in the Constitution the concepts of liberty that we think are critical, the very concepts of liberty that drove us to separate from Great Britain? And I can't believe these fellas are quoting what happened pre-revolution as though that's somehow of value to us. We left the British system. If we're really going to use pre-revolutionary history in Great Britain, then the precedent is we have a parliament and we have a king. Is that the precedent that we are headed for? Now, it's not an accident that the very first liberty, if you grant me that our liberties are enumerated in the Bill of Rights, it's not an accident that the very first liberty in the first article of the Bill of Rights is the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, etc. Congress shall make no law. The very first one, the most important one, the ability to have free and robust debate, free and robust political speech. Something that Mr. Raskin and his team brought up is that it's somehow a suggestion from former President Trump's team that when various public officials were not denouncing the violence that we saw over the summer, that was somehow the former president equating that speech to his own. Not at all. Exactly backwards. I saw a headline, Representative so-and-so seeks to walk back comments about, I forget what it was, something that bothered her. I was devastated when I saw that she thought it was necessary to go on television yesterday or the day before and say she needs to walk back her comments. She should be able to comment as much as she wants. And she should be able to say exactly as she feels. And if she feels that the supporters of then President Trump are not worthy of having their ideas considered, she should be permitted to say that. And anybody who agrees should be permitted to say they agree. That's what we broke away from Great Britain in order to be able to do. To be able to say what we thought in the most robust political debate. My colleague, Mike Vanderveen, is going to give you a recitation on the First Amendment law of the United States. I commend to your attention the analysis that he's going to give you. I don't expect, and I don't believe that the former president expects anybody to walk back any of the language. If that's how they feel about the way things transpired over the last couple of years in this country, they should be allowed to say that. And I will go to court and defend them if anything happens to them as a result. If the government takes action against that state representative or that U.S. representative who wants to walk back her comments, the government takes action against her, I have no problem going into court and defending her right to say those things, even though I don't agree with them. This trial is not about trading liberty for security. It's about suggesting that it is a good idea that we give up those liberties that we have so long fought for. We have sent armies to other parts of the world to convince those governments to implement the freedoms that we enjoy. This trial is about trading liberty for the security from the mob? Honestly, no, it can't be. We can't be thinking about that. We can't possibly be suggesting that we punish people for political speech in this country. And if people go and commit lawless acts as a result of their beliefs and they cross the line, they should be locked up. And in fact, I've seen quite a number of the complaints that were filed against the people who breached the Capitol. Some of them charge conspiracy. Not a single one of them, I noticed, charges conspiracy with the 45th President of the United States. Probably because prosecutors have an ethical requirement that they are not allowed to charge people with criminal offenses without probable cause. You might consider that. And if we go down the road that my very worthy adversary here, Mr. Raskin, asks you to go down, the floodgates will open. I was going to say it will, instead of floodgates, I was going to say originally it will release the whirlwind, which is a biblical reference. But I subsequently learned since I got here that that particular phrase has already been taken, so I figured I better change it to floodgates. But the political pendulum will shift one day. This chamber and the chamber across the way will change one day. And partisan impeachments will become commonplace. You know, until the impeachment of Bill Clinton, no one alive had ever lived through a presidential impeachment. Not unless some of you are 150 years old. Not a single person alive had lived through a presidential impeachment. Now most of us have lived through 3 of them. This is supposed to be the ultimate safety valve, the last thing that happens, the most rare treatment. And a session where this body is sitting as a court of impeachment among the most rare things it does. So the slippery slope principle will have taken hold if we continue to go forward with what is happening today and scheduled to happen later this week. And after we are long done here, and after there has been a shift in the political winds, and after there is a change in the makeup of the United States House of Representatives and maybe a change in the makeup of the United States Senate, the pressure from those folks back home, especially for members of the House, is going to be tremendous. Because remember, the founders recognized that the argument that I started with, that political pressure is driven by the need for immediate action because something under contemporary community standards really horrific happened, and the people represented by the members of the United States House of Representatives become incensed. And what do you do if a federal issue, if you're back in suburban Philadelphia and something happens that makes the people who live there incensed? You call your congressman, and your congressman, elected every 2 years with their pulse on the people of their district, 750,000 people, they respond. And boy, do they respond. The congressman calls you back, a staffer calls you back, you get all the information that they have on the issue. Sometimes you even get invited to submit language that would improve whatever the issue is. Well, when the pendulum swings, perhaps the next person that gets impeached and is sent here for you to consider is Eric Holder during Fast and Furious, the Attorney General of the United States, or any other person that the other party considers to be a political danger to them down the road because of their avowed abilities and being articulate and having a resume that shows that they're capable. I picked Eric simply because I think he has he's had a tremendous career, and he might be somebody that some Republicans somewhere might be worried about. So maybe the next person they go after is Eric Holder. And, you know, the Republicans might regain the House in 2 years. History does tend to suggest that the party out of power in the White House does well in the midterm elections, and certainly the 2020 elections, the House gained, the House majority narrowed, and there was a gain of Republicans. So the members of the House, they have to worry about these consequences, because if they don't react to whatever the problem of the day is, somebody in that jurisdiction there, somebody is going to say, if you make me the congressman, I'll react to that. And that means that the sitting member has to worry about it because their terms are short. And it's not just members of the House of Representatives with their short terms. I saw on television the last couple of days the honorable gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Sass. I saw that he faced backlash back home because of a vote he made some weeks ago. That a political party was complaining about a decision he made as a United States Senator. You know, it's interesting because I don't want to steal the thunder from the other lawyers, but Nebraska, you're going to hear, is quite a judicial thinking place. And just maybe Senator Sass is on to something. You'll hear about what it is that the Nebraska courts have to say about the issue that you all are deciding this week. They seem to be some pretty smart jurists in Nebraska, and I can't believe a United States senator doesn't know that. A senator like the gentleman from Nebraska, whose Supreme Court history is ever present in his mind, and rightfully so, he faces the whirlwind, even though he knows what the judiciary in his state thinks. People back home will demand their House members continue the cycle as political fortunes rise and fall. The only entity that stands between the bitter infighting that led to the downfall of the Greek Republic and the Roman Republic and the American Republic is the Senate of the United States. Shall the business of the Senate and thus the nation come to a halt, not just for the current weeks while a new president is trying to fill out his administration, but shall the business of the Senate and the nation come to a halt because impeachment becomes the rule rather than the rare exception? I know you can see this as a possibility because not a single one of you ever thought you would be doing a second impeachment inside of 13 months. And the pressure will be enormous to respond in kind. To quote Everett Dirksen, the gallant men and women of the Senate will not allow that to happen. And this republic will endure because the top responsibility of a United States senator and the top characteristic that you all have in common. And boy, this is a diverse group. But there isn't a single one of you who, A, doesn't consider yourself a patriot of the United States, and two, there isn't a single one of you who doesn't consider the other 99 to be patriots of the United States. And that is why this attack on the Constitution will not prevail. The document that is before you is flawed. The rule of the Senate concerning impeachment documents, Articles of Impeachment, Rule 23, says that such documents cannot be divided. You might have seen that we wrote that in the answer. It might have been a little legalistic or legalese for the newspapers to opine on very much, but there is some significance. The House managers, clever fellows that they are, they cast a broad net. They need to get 67 of you to agree they're right. And that's a good strategy. I would use the same strategy, except there is a rule that says you can't use that strategy. You see, Rule 23 says that the article of impeachment is indivisible. And the reason why that's significant is you have to agree that every single aspect of the entire document warrants impeachment because it's an all or nothing document. You can't cut out parts that you agree with warrant impeachment and parts that don't, because it's not divisible. It flat out says in the Senate rules it's not divisible. Now, previous impeachments, like President Clinton, said the president shall be found guilty of high crimes and misdemeanor for engaging in one or more of the following, and then gives a list. So all he had to do was win one. But they do that here. Has to be all or nothing. And some of these things that you are asked to consider might be close calls in your mind. But one of them is not. The argument about the 14th Amendment is absolutely Ridiculous. The House managers tell you that the president should be impeached because he violated the 14th Amendment. And here's what the 14th Amendment says. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or any other state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution, and shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may vote by 2/3 of each house to remove such disability. Now, it doesn't take a constitutional scholar to recognize that that's written for people who fought for the Confederacy or previous military officers who were in the government of the Confederacy, and it doesn't take a constitutional scholar to require that they be convicted first in a court with due process of law. So that question can never be ripe until those things have happened. Now, if you agree with those arguments, and I know you all get your constitutions out and you'll read it, and if you agree with those arguments, the suggestion that the 14th Amendment applies here is ridiculous. And if you come to that conclusion, then because the managers have not separated out the any counts within the article of impeachment, the whole thing falls. I didn't write that. They are married to that. I wrote it out in individual responses because I didn't know how to respond to the cast the wide net effort. And fortunately, senators sometime in the past realized that you can't do that because you passed a rule that says, hey, you can't do that. So that's why it's flawed. It's flawed in other ways too, and my colleagues will explain that. I was struck. I thought the House managers who spoke earlier were brilliant speakers. And I made some notes, and they'll hear about what I think about some of the things they said later when I'm closing the case. But I thought they were brilliant speakers, and I loved listening to them. And they're smart fellows. But why are the House managers afraid, and why is the majority of the House of Representatives afraid of the American people? I mean, let's understand why we are really here. We are really here because the majority in the House of Representatives does not want to face Donald Trump as a political rival in the future. That's the real reason we're here. And that's why they have to get over the jurisdictional hurdle, which they can't get over. But that's why they have to get over that in order to get to the part of the Constitution that allows removal. So that's nobody says it that plainly, but unfortunately I have a way of speaking that way. And the reason that I am having trouble with the argument is the American people just spoke, and they just changed administrations. So in the light most favorable to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here, their system works. The people are smart enough, in the light most favorable to them, they're smart enough to pick a new administration if they don't like the old one. And they just did. And he's down there at Pennsylvania Avenue now, probably wondering, how come none of my stuff is happening up at the Capitol? Why do the members of the House of Representatives, the majority of the House of Representatives, why are they afraid of the very people that sent them to do this job? The people they hope will continue to send them back here. Why are they afraid that those same people who were smart enough to pick them as their congressman aren't smart enough to pick somebody who is a candidate for president of the United States? Why fear that the people will all of a sudden forget how to choose an administration in the next few years. And in fact, this happens all the time when there are changes in administrations from one-term presidents to others. Well, Nixon was sort of a 1.5 term, but Nixon to Ford, Ford to Carter, Carter to Reagan, Bush 41 to Clinton. That happens. The people get tired of an administration they don't want, and they know how to change it. And they just did. So why think that they won't know how to do it in 2024 if they want to? Or is that what the fear is? Is the fear that the people in 2024, in fact, will want to change and will want to go back to Donald Trump and not the current occupant of the White House, President Biden? Because all these other times, the people were smart enough to do it, choose who the president should be, and all these other times, they were smart enough to choose who their members of Congress were, and by the way, choose you all as well. But they're not smart enough to know how to change the administration, especially since they just did. So it seems pretty evident to me that they do know how. It has worked 100% of the time. 100% of the time in the United States, when the people had been fed up with and had enough of the occupant of the White House, they changed the occupant of the White House. Now, I know that one of the strengths of this body is its deliberative action. And I saw Senator Manchin on the TV the other night talking about the filibuster. And the main point was that Senator Manchin was explaining to those of us who don't operate here all the time that this body has an obligation to try to reach consensus across the aisle to legitimize the decisions it makes. Obviously, he's capable of making his own pronouncements on it, but that's what it came across on the television. And I think that that is a good way of saying why the Senate of the United States is different than other places. You know, the Constitution is a document designed to protect the rights of the minority, not the rights of the majority. Congress shall make no law abridging all of these things. That's because those were the things that were of concern at the time. It's easy to be in favor of liberty and equality and free speech when it's popular. I think that I want to give my colleague, Mr. Sean, an opportunity to explain to all of us the legal analysis on jurisdiction. I'll be quite frank with you. We changed what we were going to do on account that we thought that the House manager's presentation was well done. And I wanted you to know that we have responses to those things. I thought that what the first part of the case was, which was the equivalent of a motion to dismiss, was going to be about jurisdiction alone. And one of the fellows who spoke for the House managers, who was a former criminal defense attorney, seemed to suggest that there's something nefarious that we were discussing jurisdiction and trying to get the case dismissed. But this is where it happens in the case, because jurisdiction is the first thing that has to be found. We have counter arguments to everything that they raised, and you will hear them later on in the case from Mr. Van der Veen and from myself. But on the issue of jurisdiction, the scholarly issue of jurisdiction, I'll leave you with this before I invite David to come up and give you the erudite explanation. Some of this was shown on the screen, but Article 1, Section 3 says, judgments in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and, and disqualification to hold any office of honor, trust, profit under the United States, but the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. So this idea of a January amnesty is nonsense. If my colleagues on this side of the chamber actually think that President Trump committed a criminal offense, and let's understand, a high crime is a felony and a misdemeanor is a misdemeanor. The words haven't changed that much over the time. After he's out of office, you go and arrest him. So there is no opportunity where the President of the United States can run rampant in January at the end of his term and just go away scot-free. The Department of Justice does know what to do with such people. And so far, I haven't seen any activity in that direction. And not only that, the people who stormed this building and breached it were not accused of conspiring with the president. But the section I read, judgment, in other words, the bad thing that can happen, the judgment, in cases of impeachment, i.e. what we are doing, shall not extend further than removal from office. What is so hard about that? Which of those words are unclear? Shall not extend further than removal from office. President Trump no longer is in office. The object of the Constitution has been achieved. He was removed by the voters. Mr. Schoen, are you ready? Now that I've taken all of his time, thank you, Mr. President.
Bruce Castor, the President's lead lawyer now. David Schoen, an attorney based in Georgia, who also represented the President's political ally, the President pardoned, Roger Stone.
President, leaders, quick adjustment. I stand before you on what I have always thought as the hallowed ground of democracy. In this room, American lives have been changed so dramatically in just my lifetime through so many of your legislative initiatives, from the Civil Rights Act when I was a child, through most recently the First Step Act. Laws that have provided major opportunities for Americans to move forward and upward and more fully enjoy all of the attributes of what has been the greatest nation on earth. I've seen the changes these laws have made through my clients every day for the past 36 years. These laws have enabled me to fight for their enjoyment of a fair stake in our American project. I stand before a group of 100 United States senators who have chosen to serve your country from all corners of this great nation, giving up all sorts of professions, time with family, and perhaps other more lucrative opportunities to serve your country. Mr. President, you are a man who so honorably served this nation in the Senate and in public service before your tenure here. It is an honor to appear in this historic hall of democracy, yet today, that honor is tempered by an overriding feeling of grave concern. Grave concern for the danger to the institution of the presidency that I believe even convening these proceedings indicates. The joy I believed I would feel if I ever had the great privilege of appearing before this body is replaced by sadness and pain. My overriding emotion is frankly wanting to cry for what I believe these proceedings will do to our great, so long enduring, sacred Constitution and to the American people on both sides of the great divide that now characterizes our nation. Esteemed members of the Senate, going forward with this impeachment trial of a former president of the United States is unconstitutional for reasons we have set out in our brief, some of which we'll focus on here, and as a matter of policy, it is wrong, as wrong can be for all of us as a nation. We are told by those who favor having these proceedings that we have to do it for accountability. But anyone truly interested in real accountability for what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, would of course insist on waiting for a full investigation to be completed. Indeed, one is underway in earnest already, intent on getting to the bottom of what happened. Anyone interested in ensuring that it's truly the one or ones responsible from whom accountability is sought would more than willingly wait for the actual evidence, especially with new evidence coming in every day about pre-planning, about those who were involved, and about their agenda bearing no relationship to the claims made here. They say you need this trial before the nation can heal, that the nation cannot heal without it. I say our nation cannot possibly heal with it. With this trial, you will open up new and bigger wounds across the nation, for a great many Americans see this process for exactly what it is: a chance by a group of partisan politicians seeking to eliminate Donald Trump from the American political scene and seeking to disenfranchise 74 million plus American voters and those who dare to share their political beliefs and vision of America. They hated the results of the 2016 election and want to use this impeachment process to further their political agenda. These elitists have mocked them for 4 years. They've called their fellow Americans who believe in their country and their Constitution deplorables. And the latest talk is that they need to deprogram those who supported Donald Trump and the grand old party. But at the end of the day, this is not just about Donald Trump or any individual. This is about our Constitution and abusing the impeachment power for political gain. Excuse me. They tell us that we have to have this impeachment trial, such as it is, to bring about unity. But they don't want unity, and they know this so-called trial will tear the country in half, leaving tens of millions of Americans feeling left out of the nation's agenda, as dictated by one political party that now holds the power in the White House and in our national legislature. But they're proud Americans who never quit getting back up when they're down, and they don't take dictates from another party based on partisan force-feeding. This trial will tear this country apart, perhaps like we have only seen once before in our history. And to help the nation heal, we now learn that the House managers, in their wisdom, have hired a movie company and a large law firm to create, manufacture, and splice for you a package designed by experts to chill and horrify you and our fellow Americans. They want to put you through a 16-hour presentation over 2 days, focusing on this as if it were some sort of blood sport. And to what end? For healing? For unity? For accountability? Not for any of those. For surely there are much better ways to achieve each. It is again for pure, raw, misguided partisanship that makes them believe playing to our worst instincts somehow is good. They don't need to show you movies to show you that the riot happened here. We will stipulate that it happened, and you know all about it. This is a process fueled irresponsibly by base hatred by these House managers and those who gave them their charge, and they are willing to sacrifice our national character to advance their hatred and their fear that one day they might not be the party in power. They have a very different view of democracy and freedom from Justice Jackson, who once wrote, "But freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to things that touch at the heart of the existing order. They have a very different view of democracy and freedom. This is nothing less than the political weaponization of the impeachment process. Pure, raw sport, fueled by the misguided idea of party over country, when in fact both will surely suffer. I can promise you that if these proceedings go forward, everyone will look bad. You will see and hear many members of our Congress saying and doing things they must surely regret, but perhaps far worse than a moment of personal shame in a world in which history passes from our memories in a moment. Our great country, a model for all the world, will be far more divided, and our standing around the world will be badly broken. Our arch enemies who pray each and every day for our downfall will watch with glee, glowing in the moment as they see you at your worst and our country in internal divide. Let's be perfectly clear. If you vote to proceed with this impeachment trial, future senators will recognize that you bought into a radical constitutional theory that departs clearly from the language of the Constitution itself and holds, and this is in their brief, that any civil officer who ever dares to want to serve his or her country must know that they will be subject to impeachment long after their service in office has ended, subject only to the political and cultural landscape of the day that is in operation at any future time. This is exactly the position taken by the House managers at page 65 of their brief. Unprecedented, radical position. They unabashedly say so. Imagine the potential consequences for civil officers you know and who you believed served so honorably, but who in the view of a future Congress might one day be deemed to be impeachment worthy. Imagine it now, because your imagination is the only limitation. The House managers tell you a correct reading of the impeachment power under the Constitution is that it has no temporal limit and can reach back in time without limitation to target anyone who dared to serve our nation as a civil officer. Now add that to their demand that you members put your imprimatur on the snap impeachment they returned in this case, and can do again in the future if you endorse it by going forward with this impeachment trial. This is an untenable combination that literally puts the institution of the presidency directly at risk, nothing less. And it does much more. Under their unsupportable constitutional theory and tortured reading of the text, every civil officer who has served is at risk of impeachment if any given group elected to the House decides that what was thought to be important service to the country when they served now deserves to be canceled. They've made clear in public statements that what they really want to accomplish here in the name of the Constitution is to bar Donald Trump from ever running for political office again. But this is an affront to the Constitution, no matter who they target today. It means nothing less than the denial of the right to vote and the independent right for a candidate to run for elective political office, guaranteed by the First and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution, under the guise of impeachment as a tool to disenfranchise. Perhaps my friend put the situation simply and sharply into focus last week on his radio show. My friend is a distinguished lawyer who served as an ambassador to former President Obama and has friends among you. He described himself to his listeners as a dyed-in-the-wool, lifelong Democrat. But, he said, the idea of 100 people in these circumstances deciding that tens of millions of American voters cannot cast their vote for their candidate for president ever again is unthinkable, and it truly should be. I will discuss today several reasons this matter should not and must not proceed, why the Senate lacks jurisdiction to conduct this trial of a former president, a president no longer in office and now a private citizen. Any single reason in our trial memorandum or discussed today suffices. But I want to start with a discussion of the fundamental due process lacking from the start, and that would last through the end if this goes forward, because it is this irretrievably flawed process and its product, a dangerous snap impeachment, that brings us here and that threatens to send a message into the future that we will all regret forever, and that stain this body, which up to now our founding fathers believed was uniquely suited for the most difficult task of conducting an impeachment trial, as Mr. Hamilton wrote in Federalist 65. These aren't just niceties. I make no apology for demanding in your name, in the name of the Constitution, that the rights to due process guaranteed under the Constitution are adhered to in a process as serious as this in our national lives. The denial of due process in this case, of course, starts with the House of Representatives. In this unprecedented snap impeachment process, the House of Representatives denied every attribute of fundamental constitutional due process that Americans correctly have come to believe is part of what makes this country so great. How and why did that happen? It is a function of the insatiable lust for impeachment in the House for the past 4 years. Consider this.
I want to say this for Donald Trump, who I may well be voting to impeach.
Donald Trump has already done a number of things which legitimately raise the question of impeachment.
I don't respect this president, and I will fight every day until he is impeached.
That is grounds to start impeachment proceedings. Those are grounds to start impeachment. Those are grounds to start impeachment proceedings. Yes, I think that's grounds to start impeachment proceedings.
I rise today, Mr. Speaker, to call for the impeachment of the President of the United States of America.
I continue to say, impeach him! Impeach 45! Impeach 45!
So we're calling upon the House to begin impeachment hearings immediately.
On the impeachment, Donald Trump, would you vote yes or no?
I would vote yes. I would vote to impeach.
Because we're going to go in there, we're going to impeach the motherfucker.
But the fact is, I introduced articles of impeachment in July of 2017.
If we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
My oath requires me to be for impeachment, have an impeachment hearing. He needs the scarlet eye on his chest.
The representatives should begin impeachment proceedings against this president.
It is time to bring impeachment charges against him. Bring impeachment charges.
My personal view is that he richly deserves impeachment.
I'm here at an impeachment rally, and we are ready to impeach the...
The relevant timeline in the House reveals the rush to judgment. On the day following the January 6th riot, the House leadership cynically sensed a political opportunity to score points against the outgoing then-President Trump. And the Speaker demanded that Vice President Pence invoke the 25th Amendment, threatening immediate impeachment for the President if Mr. Pence did not comply with this extraordinary and extraordinarily wrong demand. 4 days later, on January 11th, 2021, the instant article of impeachment was introduced in the House. Speaker Pelosi then gave the Vice President another ultimatum, threatening to begin impeachment proceedings within 24 hours if he did not comply. Vice President Pence rejected Speaker Pelosi's demand, favoring instead adherence to the Constitution and the best interests of the nation over a politically motivated threat. On January 12th, Speaker Pelosi announced who the 9 impeachment managers would be. And on January 13th, 2021, just days after holding a press conference to announce the launching of an inquiry, the House adopted the article of impeachment, completing the fastest impeachment inquiry in history, and according President Trump, no due process at all, over strong opposition based in large part on the complete lack of due process. To say there was a rush to judgment by the House would be a grave understatement. It is not as if the House members who voted to impeach were not mightily warned about the dangers to the institution of the presidency and about our system and to our system of due process. They were warned in the strongest of terms from within their own ranks, adamantly, clearly, and in no uncertain terms, not to take this dangerous snap impeachment course. Those warnings were framed in the context of the constitutional due process that was denied here. Consider the warnings given by one member during the House proceedings, pleading with the other members to accord this decision the due process the Constitution demands. This is Representative Cole of Oklahoma. With only 1 week to go in his term, the majority is asking us to consider a resolution impeaching President Trump. And they do so knowing full well that even if the House passes the resolution, the Senate will not be able to begin considering these charges until after President Trump's term ends. I can think of no action the House can take that is more likely to further divide the American people than the action we are contemplating today. Emotions are clearly running high, and political divisions have never been more apparent in my lifetime, Representative Cole said. Mr. Cole's words on the floor, emphasizing the care that must be taken with respect to the consideration of an article of impeachment, echoed the concerns by our founding fathers on this subject. Listen to this from Mr. Hamilton in Federalist number 65. Quote, "A well-constituted court for the trial of impeachments is an object not more to be desired than difficult to be obtained in a government wholly elective. The prosecution of them, for this reason, will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community and to divide into parties more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. In many cases, it will connect itself with pre-existing factions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence, and interest on one side or on the other. In such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt." Prescient thinking by Mr. Hamilton, as we see often. And what I say to you is a proof of the need for due process based on the critically serious nature of the singular role the impeachment process has in our government. Mr. Hamilton characterized the consideration of an impeachment in these terms: the delicacy and magnitude of a trust which so deeply concerns the political reputation and existence of every man engaged in the administration of public affairs speak for themselves. This too in Federalist 65. Now back to the House and the warnings against this rush judgment in this case. Mr. Cole of Oklahoma again. In the name of healing, a path forward, he said, our people so desperately need, he warned that, quote, "The House is moving forward erratically with a truncated process that does not comport with the modern practice and that will give members no time to contemplate the serious nature of action before us." Mr. Cole emphasized to his colleagues that such care must be taken with the consideration of an article of impeachment, quote, "in order to ensure that the American people have confidence in the procedures the House is following, and because the presidency itself demands due process in the impeachment proceedings." Congressman Cole continued, "Unfortunately," this is a quote, "the majority has chosen to race to the floor with a new article of impeachment, foregoing any investigation, any committee process, or any chance for members to fully contemplate this course of action before proceeding." Mr. Cole complained that the majority is failing to provide the House with an opportunity to review all the facts which are still coming to light, to discuss all the evidence, to listen to scholars, to examine the witnesses, and to consider precedents. He noted further, this is not the type of robust process we have followed for every modern impeachment, and the failure to do so does a great disservice to this institution and to this country, Mr. Cole said. Mr. Cole complained right on the House floor that rather than following the appropriate processes, he said the House has used in every modern impeachment, the majority is rushing to the floor, tripping all over themselves in their rush to impeach the president a second time. And in Mr. Cole's words, it was doing so to, quote, "settle scores." And he warned that this snap impeachment approach would cause great division as the country looks ahead to the start of a new administration. He said to them, in a matter as grave and consequential as impeachment, shouldn't we follow the same process we've used in every modern impeachment rather than rushing to the floor? And he implored them, on behalf of generations of Americans to come, we need to think more clearly about the consequences of our action today. And Mr. Cole then reached across the aisle and credited a member of this body, Senator Manchin, with having voiced similar sentiments about how ill-advised this rushed process was, suggesting that the underlying events were a matter for the judicial system to investigate, not one for a rushed political process. Finally, Mr. Cole admonished his fellow House members, telling them, we need to recognize that we are following a flawed process. The alarm Mr. Cole sounded went unheeded. Now let us consider the process in the House that actually was due. The House managers assert in a memorandum that the House serves as a grand jury and prosecutor under the Constitution. They told you that again today. If this is accurate, then they highlight the complete failure to adhere to due process. One should not diminish the significance of impeachment's legal aspects, particularly as they relate to the formalities of the criminal justice process. It is a hybrid of the political and legal, a political process moderated by legal formalities. This is a quote, Richard Broughton. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution provides, in relevant part, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Supreme Court long ago recognized in Matthews versus Eldridge that at its core, due process is about what we all want, what we all have the right to demand, fundamental fairness. One scholar, Brian Owsley, has written that the impeachment process should and does include some of the basic safeguards for the accused that are observed in a criminal process, such as fairness, due process, presumption of innocence, and proportionality, basic American values. And of course, we know that the Supreme Court has recognized that due process protection attend congressional investigations. While Congress is empowered to make its own rules of proceeding, it may not make rules that ignore constitutional restraints or violate fundamental rights. While the case law is limited in terms of spelling out what due process looks like in impeachment hearings, and of course in the Nixon case, Walter, not Richard, we know that there's a great deal of leeway afforded Congress with respect to its impeachment rules. It is clear that the fundamental principles that underlie our understanding of what due process must always look like apply. In Hastings versus United States, D.C. court case, vacated on different grounds, they address the matter, clearly concluding that the due process clause applies to impeachment proceedings and that it imposes an independent constitutional constraint on how the Senate exercises its sole power to try all impeachments under Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6. Court wrote in Hastings, impeachment is an extraordinary remedy. As an essential element of our constitutional system of checks and balances, impeachment must be invoked and carried out with solemn respect and scrupulous attention to fairness. Fairness and due process must be the watchword whenever a branch of the United States government conducts a trial, whether it be in a criminal case, a civil case, or a case of impeachment. A 1974 Department of Justice memo suggested the same view, opining that, quote, whether or not capable of judicial enforcement, due process standards would seem to be relevant to the manner of conducting an impeachment proceeding. More specifically, as the Hastings Court described it, one of the key principles that lies at the heart of our constitutional democracy. Again, fairness. The Supreme Court's precedents establish the general rule that individuals must receive notice and an opportunity to be heard before the government deprives them of a constitutionally protected interest. It is also true that in any proceeding that may lead to deprivation of a protected interest, it requires fair procedures commensurate with the interests at stake. Impeachment proceedings plainly involve deprivations of property and liberty interests protected by the Due Process Clause. And the House surely seeks to strip Donald Trump of his most highly cherished constitutional rights, including the right to be eligible to hold public office again, should he so choose. Due process must apply, and at a minimum, due process in the impeachment process must include that the evidence must be disclosed to the accused, and the accused must be permitted an opportunity to test and confront the evidence, particularly through the rights to confront and cross-examine witnesses, which have long been recognized as essential to due process. In almost every setting where important decisions turn on questions of fact, due process requires an opportunity to confront and cross-examine. It is unfathomable that the framers, steeped in the history of Anglo-American jurisprudence, would create a system that would allow the chief executive and commander-in-chief of the armed forces to be impeached based on a process that developed evidence without providing any of the elementary procedures that the common law developed over centuries for ensuring the proper testing of evidence in an adversarial process. We would never countenance such a system in this country. Current members of the House and Senate leadership are themselves on record repeatedly confirming these procedural due process requirements. Indeed, Congressman Nadler is on record asserting that in the context of a House impeachment investigation, due process includes, quote, the right to be informed of the law, of the charges against you, to call your own witnesses, and to have the assistance of counsel. Then President Trump was not given any semblance of the due process Congressman Nadler clearly believes he deserves, based on the congressman's description of due process that must be afforded to an accused in an impeachment proceeding, as reflected in a statement he made relating to another impeachment in 1998. No reason was found for the apparent change in the congressman's point of view with respect to the two objects of the impeachment at issue. These fundamental attributes of due process have been honored as required parts of modern impeachment protocol since at least 1870. It's not seriously debatable, nor should it be by any American legislator. In spite of all this, the House leadership defied all the norms and denied the then president all of his basic and constitutionally protected rights. For then President Donald Trump, the House impeachment procedure lacked any semblance of due process whatever. It simply cannot be credibly argued to the country, and we do not make special rules for different targets. It's the very integrity of the institution that suffers when we do, and that is what the House leadership knowingly has caused. A review of the House record reveals that the Speaker streamlined the impeachment process. House Resolution 24 to go straight to the floor for a 2-hour debate and a vote without the ability for amendments. The House record reflects no committee hearing, no witnesses, no presentation or cross-examination of evidence, and no opportunity for the accused to respond or even have counsel present to object. As the New York Times recently reported, there were no witness interviews, no hearings, no committee debates, and no real additional fact-finding. House managers claimed the need for impeachment was so urgent that they had to rush the proceedings with no time to spare for a more thorough investigation, or really any investigation at all. But that claim is belied by what happened or didn't happen next. The House leadership unilaterally and by choice waited another 12 days to deliver the article to this Senate to begin the trial process. In other words, the House leadership spent more time holding the adopted article than it did on the whole process leading up to the adoption of the article. That intentional delay, designed to avoid having the trial begin while Mr. Trump was still president, led to yet another egregious denial of due process. Excuse me. Article 1, Section 3 of our Clause 6 of our Constitution, of course, provides in pertinent part that the Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, they shall be on oath or affirmation, and when the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. By intentionally waiting until President Trump's term of office expired before delivering the article of impeachment to the Senate to initiate trial proceedings, Speaker Pelosi deprived then-President Trump of the express constitutional right and the right under the Senate's own Rule 4 to have the Chief Justice of the United States preside over his trial and wield the considerable power provided for in the rules of procedure and practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials. That power includes, under Rule 5, the presiding officer's exclusive right to make and issue all orders, under Rule 7, to make all evidentiary orders, subject to objections by a member of the Senate. We say respectfully that this intentional delay by Speaker Pelosi, such that in the intervening period, President Trump became private citizen, Mr. Trump, constitutes a lapse or waiver of jurisdiction here. For Mr. Trump no longer is the president, described as subject to impeachment in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6, and in Article 2, Section 4. And this body, therefore, has no jurisdiction as a function of that additional due process violation by Speaker Pelosi. Moreover, with all due respect, then President Trump suffered a tangible detriment from Speaker Pelosi's actions, which violates not only his rights to due process of law, but also his express constitutional right to have the Chief Justice preside. That tangible detriment includes the loss of the right to a conflict-free, impartial presiding officer, with all due respect. The very purpose behind requiring the Chief Justice to preside over the president's impeachment trial, along with the other benefits of having the two branches combined, the Chief Justice from the judiciary and the Senate, for the impeachment trial of the president, reflected in Federalist 66. one of the reasons the Chief Justice was chosen for that task. Mr. Trump now faces a situation in which the presiding officer will serve as both judge, with all the powers that the rules endow him with, and juror with a vote. And beyond that, the presiding officer, although enjoying a lifelong honorable reputation, of course, has been Mr. Trump's vocal and adamant opponent throughout the Trump administration, and in fact, in the very matter on trial, the presiding officer respectfully already has publicly announced his fixed view before hearing any argument or evidence that Mr. Trump must be convicted on the article of impeachment before the Senate, and indeed that members in both parties have an obligation to vote to convict as well. Nowhere in this great country would any American, and certainly not this honorable presiding officer, consider this scenario to be consistent with any stretch of the American concept of due process and a fair trial, and certainly not even the appearance of either. By no stretch of the imagination could any fair-minded American be confident that a trial so conducted would or could be the fair trial promised by the leader. While most procedural aspects of a Senate impeachment trial may be non-justiciable political questions, this is not an excuse to ignore what law and precedent clearly require. The present situation either presents a violation of the constitutional text found in the articles mentioned above that require the Chief Justice to preside when the president is on trial, or it is a clear denial of due process and fair trial rights for private citizen Trump to face an impeachment trial so conducted by the Senate. The impeachment article should be treated as a nullity and dismissed based on the total lack of due process in the House. It should be dismissed because of Speaker Pelosi's intentional abandonment or waiver of jurisdiction, if the House ever acquired jurisdiction. And the article should be dismissed because the trial in the Senate of a private citizen is not permitted, let alone with the conflicts just described that attend this proceeding. Finally, on the subject of due process in this matter, I say the following. This is our nation's sacred Constitution. It has served us well since it was written, and it's been amended only through a careful process. It is a document unique in all the world. It is a foundational part of what makes the United States a beacon of light among the other nations of the world. It not only has room for a tremendous variety of perspectives on the philosophical and political direction our country should take, it encourages the advocacy of our differences. But we have long held that fundamental to its health and well-being, and therefore to ours as a nation, is its insistence on due process for every citizen. The emphasis on the right to due process long ago was recognized as its life breath, a primary guarantor of its eternal viability as our political, civic, and national guiding light. We all well know that there are many systems in other countries around the world that do not offer any semblance of the safeguards our constitutional concept of due process provides. Some of them have chosen their own handbooks, which direct their citizens' conduct on penalty of death. This is one of them. There can be no room for due process in such a system as this, or the system would be lost. Snap decisions are required in a system like this to maintain power for one political philosophy over all others in those kinds of systems. But we as a nation have rejected those systems and the kind of snap decisions they demand to maintain control for one party, for one point of view, and for an imposed way of life. We choose to live freely under a constitution that guarantees our freedom. Other countries fear those freedoms and seek to ensure adherence to a party line in all civic, political, spiritual, and other affairs, and to ensure that the party line is towed in those systems have no place for due process. Snap decisions that remove political figures are the norm. Maintaining their systems depend on it. That is not our way in America, and never must be. We choose in America to live by our Constitution and its amendments, and the due process this document demands for every citizen among us. By putting your imprimatur on the snap judgment made in this matter, to impeach the President of the United States without any semblance of due process at every step along the way puts the office of the President of the United States at risk every single day. It is far too dangerous a proposition to countenance, and you must resoundingly reject it by sending the message now that this proceeding, lacking due process from start to finish, must end now with your vote that you lack jurisdiction to conduct an impeachment trial for a former president whose term in office has expired and who is now a private citizen. So one reason you must send this message here and now is because of the complete lack of due process that brought this article of impeachment before this body. God forbid we should ever lower our vigilance to the principle of due process. An impeachment trial of a private citizen Trump held before the Senate would be nothing more nor less than the trial of a private citizen by a legislative body. An impeachment trial by the Senate of a private citizen violates Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, which provides that no bill of attainder shall be passed. The bill of attainder, as this clause is known, prohibits Congress from enacting a law that legislatively determines guilt and inflicts punishment upon an identifiable individual without provision of the protections of a judicial trial. A bill of attainder is a legislative act which inflicts punishment without a judicial trial. A judicial trial. The distinguishing characteristic of a bill of attainder is the substitution of a legislative determination of guilt and legislative imposition of punishment for judicial finding and sentence. The Bill of Attainder clause in the separation of powers doctrine generally reflects the framers' concern that trial by a legislature lacks the safeguards necessary to prevent the abuse of power. As the Supreme Court explained in United States versus Brown, the best available evidence, the writings of the architects of our constitutional system, indicate that the Bill of Attainder clause was intended not as a narrow, technical, and therefore soon-to-be outmoded prohibition, but rather as an implementation of the separation of powers, a general safeguard against legislative exercise of the judicial function. More simply, trial by legislature. The Bill of Attainder reflected the framers' belief that the legislative branch is not so well suited as politically independent judges and juries. When the Senate undertakes an impeachment trial of a private citizen, as it clearly understands to be the case here, supported by the facts that the Chief Justice is not providing and Mr. Trump is not the president, it is acting as a judge and jury rather than a legislative body. And this is exactly the type of situation that the Bill of Attainder constitutional provision was meant to preclude. It is clear that disqualification from holding future office, the punishment the House managers intend to seek here, is a kind of punishment, like a banishment and others, that is subject to the constitutional prohibition against the passage of bills of attainder, under which general designation bills of pains and penalties are included. The cases include Cummings, Ex parte Garland, and this Brown case. The Supreme Court 3 times has struck down provisions that precluded support of the South or support of communism from holding certain jobs as being in violation of this prohibition. Thus, the impeachment of a private citizen in order to disqualify them from holding office is an unconstitutional act constituting a bill of attainder. Moreover, this is the exact type of situation in which the fear would be great that some members of the Senate might be susceptible to acting in the haste the House acted in when it rushed through the article of impeachment in less than 48 hours, acting hastily simply to appease the popular clamor of their political base, the very kind of concern expressed by Mr. Hamilton in Federalist 65. Moreover, as Chief Justice Marshall warned in Fletcher versus Peck, it is not to be disguised that the framers of the Constitution viewed with some apprehension the violent acts which might grow out of the feelings of the moment, and that the people of the United States, in adopting that instrument, have manifested a determination to shield themselves and their property from the effects of those sudden and strong passions to which men and women are exposed. The restrictions on the legislative power of the states are obviously founded in this sentiment. and the Constitution of the United States contains what may be deemed a Bill of Rights for the people of each state. No state shall pass any bill of attainder in this form. The power of the legislature over the lives and fortunes of individuals is expressly restrained. And so now let's turn to the text of the Constitution. Turning to the text of the Constitution is for many, of course, the most appropriate and the most important starting place for trying to answer a Constitution-based question. There are several passages of the United States Constitution that relate to the federal impeachment process. Let's turn to a reading of the text now. A true textual analysis, as the name implies, always begins with the words of the text and only resorts to legislative history or history itself if the meaning of the text is not plain. As the Supreme Court has emphasized, statutory interpretation, as we always say, begins with the text. In interpreting the text, we are guided by the principle that the Constitution was written to be understood by the voters. Its words and phrases were used in their normal and ordinary, as distinguished from technical meaning. And we must enforce plain and unambiguous statutory language according to its terms. If the president is impeached, the unambiguous text of the Constitution commands that the Chief Justice of the United States shall preside, as we discussed earlier. Again, the Chief Justice is disinterested and nonpartisan. His presence brings dignity and solemnity to such a proceeding. In this case, the Chief Justice clearly is not presiding, and the conflict of interest wouldn't necessarily just arise as a substitute for the Vice President. It's the appearance of a conflict of interest and the prejudgment that we've discussed. In this case, as we say, the Chief Justice clearly is not presiding. The Senate President pro temp is presiding. It appears that in the leader's view, undoubtedly joined by other senators, this is permitted by the Constitution because the subject of the trial is a non-president. As such, it is conceded, as it must be, that for constitutional purposes of the trial, the accused is a non-president. The role of the Senate, though, is to decide whether or not to convict and thereby trigger the application of Article 2, Section 4, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for, conviction of, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. From which office shall a non-president be removed if convicted? A non-president doesn't hold an office, therefore cannot be impeached under this clause, which provides for the removal from office of the person under the impeachment attack. The House managers contend that the fact that the Chief Justice is not providing does not impact the constitutional validity of this trial. Notably, they devote only a single paragraph of their trial memorandum to development so significant that it prompted multiple senators to declare the entire proceeding suspect, with one going so far as to say that it crystallized the unconstitutional nature of this proceeding. And the single paragraph that the House managers do devote to the issue is entirely unpersuasive on the merits. The House managers' position ignores traditional statutory canons of interpretation. It is well established that a term, as a matter of statutory interpretation, that a term appearing in several places in a statutory text is generally read the same way each time it appears. This presumption is at its most vigorous when a term is repeated within a given sentence. Requiring the Chief Justice to preside can refer only to the sitting president and not to former presidents. Then the textual identification of the president contained in Article 2, Section 4, which makes the president amenable to impeachment in the first place, also excludes anyone other than the sitting president. In full, that sentence provides that, quote, the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. This is the substantive phrase of the Constitution, vesting the conviction and removal power in the Senate, and it contains a clear jurisdictional limitation. The House managers do understand what the word president means for purposes of other constitutional provisions, and so they should understand this limitation as well. Only a sitting president is referred to as the President of the United States in the Constitution, and only a sitting president may be impeached, convicted, and removed upon a trial in the Senate. The President in Article 2, Section 4, and the President in Article 1, Section 3 identify the same person. If the accused is not the president in one, he is not the president in the other. No sound textual interpretation, I emphasize textual, no sound textual interpretation principle permits a contrary reading. In the words of the Supreme Court, it is a normal rule of statutory construction that identical words used in different parts of the same act are intended to have the same meaning. Unwittingly or unwillingly, as it may be, Senate Democrats, in their announcement that Senator Leahy is presiding, have already taken their position on this matter. The accused is not the president. The text of the United States Constitution, therefore, does not vest the Senate with the power to try him and remove him, a factual nullity, he can't be removed, something, or disqualify him, a legal nullity, as if he were the president. House managers contend the Senate has jurisdiction over this impeachment because despite the fact that he's no longer the president, the conduct that the former president is charged occurred while he was still in office. That argument does not in any way alter the Constitution's clear textual identification of the president. House managers justify their strained argument by noting that the Constitution's impeachment provisions are properly understood by reference to this overarching constitutional plan. But with that very justification in mind, their argument fails once again. In an impeachment, it is the accused's office that permits the impeachment. Ceasing to hold that office terminates the possibility and the purpose of impeachment. Private persons may not be impeached in America. And so they asked you to look back at the British model. The Constitution, as I say, does not make private citizens subject to impeachment. The founders rejected the British model that allowed Parliament to impeach anyone except for the king. And so they limited impeachment to certain public officials, including presidents in our country. Next, on the textual front, the primary, in fact, the only required remedy of conviction is removal. Article 2, Section 4, straightforward rule. Whenever a civil officer is impeached and convicted for high crimes and misdemeanors, they shall be removed. It is undeniable that in this instance, removal is moot in every possible regard. Removal is a factual and legal impossibility. Yet the article of impeachment itself, read it in the wherefore clause, it calls for removal. This is one reason why impeachment proceedings are different from ordinary trials and why the Constitution pointedly separates the two. In ordinary criminal jurisprudence, a person convicted of public crimes while he or she was in office may still be punished even though they no longer hold that office. Not so with impeachment. In a Senate impeachment trial, conviction means and requires removal. And conviction without a removal is no conviction at all. Only upon a valid conviction and its requisite enforceable removal may the additional judgment of disqualification plausibly be entertained. Presidents are impeachable because presidents are removable. Former presidents are not because they cannot be removed. The Constitution is clear. Trial by the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment is reserved for the President of the United States, not a private citizen who used to be President of the United States. Just as clear, the judgment required upon conviction is removal from office, and a former president can no longer be removed from office. The purpose, text, and structure of the Constitution impeachment clauses confirm this intuitive and common sense understanding. So wrote Judge Michael Ludwig, former judge in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. And indeed, there are state court decisions that analyze this very same language and conclude that impeachment can only be entertained against an existing officer subject to removal. Read State versus Hill from Nebraska and Smith versus Brantley, 1981 decision from the Florida Supreme Court. This is the first time that the United States Senate has ever been asked to apply the Constitution's textual identification of the president in the impeachment provisions to anyone other than the sitting president of the United States. And of course, most significantly from a textual approach, the term specifically used is the president, not a president. And there can be only one president, the incumbent at a time. Judge Ludwig relies on this textual reading for his firm conclusion that a former president cannot be impeached or convicted. Consider the alternative, as Robert Delahunty, Professor John Yoo have. If Mr. Trump can be convicted as the president, the language the Constitution uses, then why is he not still the president under the Commander-in-Chief clause?
for example. They are joined by Professor Alan Dershowitz and University of Chicago Professor Richard Epstein in their focus and conclusion. They point out the dangers of an approach that deviates from a focus on the text, if there is no temporal limitation. That's what they've suggested to you. Remember, you can go back in time and impeach any civil officer who ever served for anything that occurred during the course of their service, time immemorial. With the House manager's position, the concept necessarily includes all former executive officers and judges, including perhaps the impeachment now of Jimmy Carter for his handling of the Iran hostage scandal, as one example. That flows logically from their argument without any hesitation. Further, they ask, why not then countenance a broad reading of other terms? When I say they ask, I mean these experts who've opined on this. Why not then countenance a broad reading of other terms, such as the terms like high crimes and misdemeanors, however broadly construed, are intended to be exclusively the only kind of conduct intended as impeachable. They conclude, these experts, that by writing that a non-textual impeachment power would undermine the Constitution's effort to make the president independent of Congress, a central goal of the Founding Fathers. The authors convincingly argue for textual analysis over non-textual analysis, over non-textual reliance on a presentation of history, suggesting that if one's presentation of history were to control, it would expressly permit conduct contrary to the express language, leading to clearly unintended results. And I must tell you that I've spoken to Judge Ken Starr at some length over this past week about this, and this textual approach is something he too feels very strongly about. I also happen to be friendly with Chuck Cooper, by the way, who's a fine person. Also happens to be a person who has a strong animus against President Trump. But Chuck Cooper is a fine lawyer and a fine person, as I'm sure our friends from Alabama know. As we already have discussed, the risks to the institution of the presidency and to any and all past officers is limited only by one's imagination. The weakness of the House manager's case is further demonstrated by their reliance on the unproven assertion that if President Trump is not impeached, future officers who are impeached will evade removal by resigning, either before impeachment or Senate trial. For example, they contend, citing various law professors, that, quote, any official who betrayed the public trust and was impeached could avoid accountability simply by resigning 1 minute before the Senate's final conviction vote. This argument is a complete canard. The Constitution expressly provides in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7, that a convicted party following impeachment shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law after removal. Clearly, a former civil officer who's not impeached is subject to the same. We have a judicial process in this country. We have an investigative process in this country to which no former office holder is immune. That's the process that should be running its course. That's the process the Bill of Attainder tells us is the appropriate one for investigation, prosecution, and punishment, with all of the attributes that branch. We're missing it by 2 articles here, that the Article 3 courts provide. They provide that kind of appropriate adjudication. That's accountability. There are appropriate mechanisms in place for full and meaningful accountability, not through the legislature, which does not and cannot offer the safeguards of the judicial system which every private citizen is constitutionally entitled. But more to the point here, their argument does nothing to empower a different reading of the Constitution's plain text. That is, one that reads the president in one provision to include former presidents, but reads the president in the other provision to mean only the sitting president. Second, this red herring of an argument also fails because the former president did not resign, even amid calls by his opponents that he do so. As a result, the Senate need not decide whether it possesses the power or jurisdiction to try and convict a former president who resigned, or how it might best proceed to effectuate justice in such a case. That's not this case. The plain meaning of the Constitution's text, faithfully and consistently applied, should govern whether the United States Senate is vested by the Constitution with the power to convict a private citizen of the United States. It is not. The House managers posit in their trial memorandum that despite the fact that the primary and only necessary remedy upon conviction, removal, is a legal nullity, this late impeachment trial is appropriate because the other, secondary, optional remedy that the Senate is not even required to consider and which only takes effect upon a later separate vote, disqualification from future office, can still theoretically be applied to a former president. The managers contend Article 2, Section 4 states a straightforward rule. Whenever a civil officer is impeached and convicted for high crimes and misdemeanors, they shall be removed. Absolutely nothing about this rule implies, let alone requires, that former officials who can still face disqualification are immune from impeachment and conviction. That's what they say. They told you that today. In other words, so the argument goes, a president no longer holding office does not moot the entirety of remedies afforded by impeachment. This, however, also flies in the face of both the plain meaning of the text and the canons of statutory interpretation. First of all, the managers once again simply choose to ignore the text. Even in the passage that the managers cite, the word shall does, to put it mildly, imply a requirement. An imperative such that an impeachment in which removal would be impossible is invalid. Shall means shall. The Supreme Court has made clear that when a statute uses the word shall, Congress has imposed a mandatory duty upon the subject of the command, as in shall remove. Indeed, the mandatory shall normally creates an obligation impervious to judicial discretion. And wherever the Constitution commands, discretion terminates. Shall means mandatory, and shall be removed is not possible for a former officer no longer in office. Impeachment cannot apply. Now here's the and argument you may have heard about, read about, if you follow such things. This is another one Judge Starr is big on, and many of the textual scholars have written about. Managers critically ignore this language in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7, which states that judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification, from office, comma, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Ordinarily, as in everyday English, use of the conjunctive and in a list means that all of the listed requirements must be satisfied, while use of the disjunctive or means that only one of the listed requirements needs to be satisfied. Judge Kenneth Starr subscribes strongly to this argument and understands the comma to provide further support for the reading. Judge Michael Ludwig, again, recently argued, the Constitution links the impeachment remedy of disqualification from future office with the remedy of removal from the office that person currently occupies. The former remedy does not apply in situations where the latter is unavailable. Conviction and removal are inextricably intertwined. If removal no longer is possible, neither is an impeachment conviction. Judge Ludwig's view is consistent with that of Justice Joseph Story in his famous commentaries on the Constitution, wherein Justice Story analyzed impeachment is inapplicable to officials who have left their position because removal, a primary remedy that the impeachment process authorizes, is no longer necessary. Justice Story noted that he is not coming to a firm posit on this. This is his belief, and this is his thought process. There's also much force in the remark that an impeachment is a proceeding purely of a political nature. It is not so much designed to punish an offender as to secure the state against gross official misdemeanors. It touches neither his person nor his property, but simply divests him of his political capacity. Professor Philip Bobbitt. Now, I have to say this is insulting. We heard earlier today, we don't cite any scholars. Professor Philip Bobbitt is the distinguished Wexler professor at Columbia University who, along with Professor Charles Black, wrote the handbook on impeachment used for many, many years. He is a constitutional expert on impeachment. He has written that there is little discussion in the historical record surrounding the precise question of whether a person no longer a civil officer can be impeached. And in light of the clarity of the text, this is hardly surprising, Professor Bobbitt wrote. Professor Bobbitt, by the way, who has a rich family history in the Democratic Party, LBJ, also asserted the following as recently as January 27, 2021, arguing against holding this trial. He said, quote, "There is no authority granted to Congress to impeach and convict persons who who are not civil officers of the United States. It's as simple as that. But simplicity doesn't mean unimportance, Professor Bobbitt wrote. Limiting Congress to its specified powers is a crucial element in the central idea of the United States Constitution, putting the state under law. Professor Bobbitt and former Stanford University law professor Richard Danzig have remarked that impeachment's principal purpose, as the 66th of the Federalist Papers makes clear, is to check the encroachments of the executive. Trial by jury, rules of evidence, and other safeguards are put aside, they write, because of the need to protect the public from further abuse of office. Similarly, yesterday, Professor Eugene Konorovich wrote, "The Constitution provides that the impeachment process is to be used to remove all civil officers of the United States, that is, people holding a government position. Yet in the case of Mr. Trump, the House is reading the Constitution as if it said the process applies to all civil officers of the United States and people who aren't civil officers but once were. Exactly what it does not say." We've been told by the House managers about miscitations in our brief. I'd like to draw your attention to page 37. This is a substantive misrepresentation to you, I would respectfully suggest. And it reflects to me a very different view of democracy, a fear of democracy. They wrote on page 37 of their brief that the framers, I'm paraphrasing the first part, the framers themselves would not have hesitated to convict on these facts. Their worldview, this is a quote now, was shaped by a study of classical history as well as a lived experience of resistance and resolution. They were aware of the danger posed by opportunists who incited mobs to violence for political gain. They drafted the Constitution to avoid such thuggery, which they associated with the threat of civil disorder and early assumption of power by a dictator. The citation is 178, Bernard Bailyn, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. That's this book. Professor Bailyn, when he gave this description of the threat of civil disorder and the early assumption of power by a dictator and thuggery, was referring to early colonists' view toward democracy. They feared democracy. That's what they call thuggery. Democracy, because it's an elitist point of view, an elitist political point of view. We don't fear democracy, we embrace it. In summing up, let's be crystal clear on where we stand and why we are here. The singular goal of the House managers and House leadership in pursuing the impeachment conviction of Donald J. Trump is to use these proceedings to disenfranchise at least 74 million Americans with whom they viscerally disagree, and to ensure that neither they nor any other American ever again can cast a vote for Donald Trump. And if they convince you to go forward, their ultimate hope is that this will be a shot across the bow of any other candidate for public office who would dare to take up a political message that is very different from their own political point of view as the direction in which they wish to take our country. Under our Constitution, this body and the impeachment process must never be permitted to be weaponized for partisan political purposes. This article of impeachment must be dismissed for lack of jurisdiction based on what we have discussed here today and what's in our brief. The institution of the presidency is at risk unless a strong message is sent by the dismissal of the article of impeachment. Before we close, I want to leave you with two thoughts. One was expressed by Abraham Lincoln. He comes to mind first because of the way in which our nation is now divided. We must learn from his times. He had a simple but important message about the paramount importance of doing what is right. Mr. Lincoln said, stand with anybody that stands right, stand with him when he is right, and part with him when he goes wrong. In both cases, you are right. In both cases, you oppose the dangerous extremes. In both cases, you stand on moral ground and hold the ship level and steady. In both, you are national and nothing less than national. And the second message is from one of Mr. Lincoln's favorite poets, who wrote in 1849 at a time fraught with division and risk for even more. The message from that other time of division is a call for hope and unity to bring strength. It has special meaning today. Poet Longfellow wrote, Sail forth into the sea, O ship, through wind and wave, right onward steer. The moistened eye, the trembling lip, are not the signs of doubt or fear. Sail forth into the sea of life, O gentle, loving, trusting wife, and safe from all adversity, upon the bosom of that sea, thy comings